All right, so since we have literary scholars here, somebody tell me how Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol begins.
Marley was dead.
Marley was dead to begin with.
From the beginning.
Marley was dead to begin with. But that's strange. You wouldn't generally start a book with something so dark and definite. Because if something is dead, it is dead. In fact, he goes on to describe that even better. He said he was as dead as a doornail. He was dead. When you start reading Leviticus 16, it kind of has that same feel. It's very much like the Christmas Carol. And the Lord spoke unto Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died. Well, okay, so why start this incredibly important decree from the Lord? He is about to give the most holy instructions for the most holy day ever in the Israelite custom, in their history, in their whole walk with Him. Why start with this? So to understand why we started this particular event with the death of Aaron's sons, let's go back just a little bit. We're going to go back to Leviticus 10, verses 1 and 2. And we're going to read that. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took each of them his censer. Anybody know what a censer is?
It's like a little metal bowl that they put like something that burns and creates smoke and usually smells nice.
Sometimes, incense. Sometimes you'll see, I believe it's, y'all forgive me if my religions aren't all right, but I think it's the Catholics. The priest will go in with this little silvery bowl or gold bowl on a chain, and he's doing this, and smoke's going everywhere, and it's all fancy and pretty. Well, that's basically what this was. And it wasn't as much about ceremony as it was about transferring or transporting fire, because you can't just pick up fire and move from one place to the other. Incense was very important because it was a sign of worship. Incense is always a sign of worship in the Bible. And so there were commandments that had been given that were very clear. And both of the priests the sons had their own censers. Okay. And they took each of them his censer and put fire therein and laid incense thereon and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And there came forth fire from before the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. So, this sounds very grim. Kind of reminds me a lot of the beginning of the church when Ananias and Sapphira came in and everybody's giving their offerings, and they gave their offering and then they died. Sounds like, well, okay, something went wrong, something went awry. Well, their deal was that they brought in deception into the church. And it's kind of setting a precedence. Remember that grocery store story? If you deal with an issue at the very beginning of that issue, then it sets it in everyone's mind, this is the issue, this is the consequence, don't do issue. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. When Ananias and Sapphira came in and they gave a deceitful offering, they lied, they died. After that, it was a warning to the rest of the church, not that they had to give all their money, but don't lie.
Yeah.
Don't bring in disunity, don't bring in deceit, don't try to be shifty on this. Shiftiness is a serious spirit. Don't bring in shiftiness. And that's my translation of that spirit. I doubt there's a spirit called shiftiness, but there's, deception and all that. Okay. So we'll just use that as Amy's translation tonight. With the two sons, they were there during the 9 months of building the temple. They are tabernacle. They knew from Moses, from God, the exact pattern that everything had to happen, the way things were to be done, what they were supposed to do, when they were supposed to do it. They had been consecrated, dedicated, washed and scrubbed and presented as priests before the Lord. They knew what they were supposed to do. But they decided to do more. And so they go into the holy place. Now remember, not the Holy of Holies. The little tent inside the big tent is the holy place. Behind the veil inside that tent is where the Holy of Holies sit. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. The holy place is the outer part of that inner tent that has the showbread and the menorah and the altar of incense. Okay, everybody with me on that? So they go into that and they take their own fire and light their little censers. Seems harmless enough. You know why it wasn't? Anybody want to guess why that wasn't harmless?
Because they didn't sacrifice.
Because it was something they weren't supposed to do.
They weren't supposed to do it.
It wasn't God ordained.
Okay, it wasn't God ordained. Oh, that's right. Where did the fire come from?
The Bible says it was strange fire.
Mm-hmm. It also just says that they lit it.
It didn't come from the altar.
You see, God would light the altar of sacrifice, of giving myself, of sacrificing my flesh. The fire from that altar was transferred to the incense. Strange fire is fire that doesn't originate at that altar. Strange fire is worship that happens without a sacrifice. Woo, I just had a flashback. There is a sermon, and if you want to look it up, I believe Brother Doug White preached it, called "Don't Dance on Altars You Didn't Build." And he's talking about Elisha or Elijah, whichever one it was with Jezebel. I'm so dyslexic. Whichever one it was. He was talking about them tearing down the altars. The thing is, if you don't sacrifice something of yourself, if you try to take yourself and what you think is right into worship, you have defiled a holy place. Yeah. That's the point there. So they lit the censers and didn't take the fire from the offering and the time and the ordained place and all that God had given them. So not everything. This is me preaching. Now I was going to skip it, but I'm not going to. I'm sure it looked right. They were dressed right. They had their censers. It had the little smoke, whatever. It looked like worship. It looked like they had lit their incense. It was good. Everything was great. But it was out of place. It wasn't what God had called. Not everything that looks like worship is worship.
Yeah. That's right.
The devil can mimic tongues.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely.
That is not everything that looks like worship is worship. So I threw this in there, and it's not my things up there, but it's an added note. John 4:23 makes a very compelling statement on this. It says, "But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth." There's two components that, spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. There are people who can worship God in spirit, but God doesn't know them.
Yep.
There are people who know the truth but don't seek the Spirit.
Yeah.
And they are driven by logic.
Yep.
You have to have spirit and truth in order to worship him. All right, back to Leviticus chapter 16, verse 2. So only one time of the year was the high priest allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. Speak unto Aaron, I think it is. Speak unto Aaron thy brother, that he come not at all times into the holy place within the veil, before the ark cover which is upon the ark, that he die not. Only one time a year. That was a whole lot of backwards speaking to say don't go in except for this one time. For I appear in the cloud upon the ark cover. This is God telling Moses to tell Aaron. Okay? Herewith shall Aaron come into the holy place with a young bullock for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Okay? One time of year, this has to happen. First, and he shall put on the holy linen tunic, and he shall have the linen breeches upon his flesh. He shall be girded with the linen girdle, and with the linen mitre shall he be attired. They are the holy garments, and he shall bathe his flesh in water and put them on. So let's notice two things about this, okay? We're talking about the Day of Atonement here, Yom Kippur. Some people just celebrated that like a week or two ago. It's normally on the 10th of October. Let's look at these two verses for a second. First of all, before he did anything else, the priest brought two things for sacrifice. He'd bring a young bull for the sin offering for himself and his family. Because you can't lead people into a place that you have not been.
That's right.
So go deeper. And then he would also take a ram for a burnt offering. And that's the guilt offering that we talked about the other night. Okay? So this is for himself and for his household. And then he would dress himself. He would make sure that he was clean. He would go through the ritual bath, and then he would gird himself up. Now, anybody remember anything about the garments on the high priest that we talked about?
There were lots of them.
There's a lot of it. Like, it's a full shindig.
Oh, yeah, they had this one, like it was just one, there was no seams or anything.
There was
and
the
that
ephod.
Was the under whatever, and then they had the thing with the tassels.
Had
And they
it,
had the plate with all
the plate with all the gems and the flashy, dazzled stuff. And then they had the fancy hat, and they had all the blue, and it was bright and colorful and all that kind of stuff. And this signified to everybody that this was the high priest. This was the person that talked beyond the veil to God, and he would use these stones. He would direct the people. He was the mediator between God and the people. Okay? You remember all that fancy stuff that he wore? None of that got to go into the holy place. Because when he went to make an atonement, when he went into the Holy of Holies, beyond the veil, he has already sacrificed for himself and for his family. He has washed. Now he is in a place where he is humble, and it is just him and his plain white linen garments. Just plain white linen garments. Now this is sidetracking me. I'm hearing it for the first time too, so forgive me if I don't get it all perfectly clear. But from what I understand, even today, when a devout Jewish person dies and they are buried in a plain white linen garment. Because it doesn't matter on the other side. And when you go into judgment and you meet your Maker, you are no different than someone who has nothing. And they understand that concept. It's a white linen garment. The other thing is that if you were a male, you would be wrapped in your prayer tent or your prayer shawl. This would have been the thing that connected you to heaven, and they would wrap you into it, and you would go into the next world being wrapped into your prayer cloth or your prayer shawl. It's a beautiful thing. We'll get into that more later, but this is something that has carried on. You see all of these things about the priest standing before the Ark of the Covenant. He's got all these fancy things on, and he's colorful, and he's bright, and he's just like, woo, look at me. That's not at all. Not at all. When he went in beyond the veil, it was just him. It was a very humble, not bright, whatever kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he would have been in plain white garments, no fanciness. This is a lot like how we sacrifice our flesh on the altar before we go into his presence. That way he shines and not us. Because no flesh will glory in his presence. That's why we got to get rid of all of us. And that doesn't mean beat yourself up. It means surrender it. You know, a lot of people confuse what humbleness really is. To be humble, people misinterpret that and they think, oh, I'm nothing, I'm horrible. Oh, I'm just a dog. My lowly self. That's not at all humility, and that's actually a form of pride. It's drawing attention to how lowly you are. Humility is taking all of the attention that's given to you and directing it to God.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, you're a beautiful singer. Man, you just rock the place when you sing. Thank you very much. That's nothing but the presence of God. That God gave me that talent. If he wasn't there, then
Yeah.
that's humility. Not, oh, well, did you hear all the ways that I squeak? Humility is directing the attention back to God.
Right.
All right, verse 5. And he shall take of the congregation of the children of Israel 2 he-goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. That covers that same deal. That's his offering that he's supposed to take. No, it's not. The burnt offering is. The 2 he-goats. All right, let's cover that. So Aaron's got to take 2 goats. 2 goats. This is besides his personal offering. This is for the children of Israel. They had to be roughly the same size, the same color. They had to be worth the same amount of money. They both had to be inspected. They had to be good he-goats. Okay? He-goat sounds hilarious to me. It's a guy goat. He-goat. It's a he-man, he-goat. He would present these goats on this one day of the year, the most holy day of the year. He would present them to the children of Israel, or for the children of Israel, while holding 2 boxes. Okay? He has these 2 boxes, and both of them contain a phrase in them. So he's got a goat here and a goat here. I'm going to make life-size goats. I promise it's going to happen. That way Bible study knocks it up a notch. It's coming soon, y'all. Just hang on, all right? So we're going to have goats eventually. But he would take 2 goats, and he would have a box in each hand. Hang on just a minute. Don't go any further. He'd have a box in each hand, and each box would contain a phrase. Okay? On this phrase, one would say, the goat for the Lord, or for the Lord, and one would say, for Azazel. Now, and we'll get into that. Just hang on. We'll get to that. So basically, 1 goat was for the sin, 1 goat was for the guilt. 2 different goats. So as he opens this box and he reads the phrases, whichever for this sake, let's say that the goat on the right says the goat for the Lord, okay, in this box. This goat is going to die today. He's going to be sacrificed today. He has been designated. He is the goat for the sin offering. So they would take a long strip of dyed wool that's dyed crimson red, and they would wrap it around the goat's neck. Okay? And that's kind of what he's doing there. The reason for this is because, remember how I said they had to be similar in weight and size and all that kind of stuff? They want to make sure that if something goes awry, something spooks the goat, it gets away or whatever, that goat always, they know that that's the goat that's going to be for the Lord. Okay? So they would take that, and they would put the red cloth around his neck. He would then take his hands, the priest would take his hands, and he would press them down on the goat's head. Does that sound familiar? He'd press them down on the goat's head, and then he would confess the sins of the nation, of the whole nation as a whole. If the whole nation had been involved in idolatry, if the whole nation had lost faith, if the whole nation had decided that it was cool to sacrifice their children, if the whole nation had let in foreign gods, whatever it was, the priest would confess those sins as he pressed into the head of this goat. He would then take the wool, he would tie it around the neck, and then that goat would be taken off and sacrificed and burnt completely. Now, remember, sometimes there were provisions where the priesthood would get part of the meat or the fur or whatever it was at the time. Not with this. The entire offering was to be burnt on the sacrifice or on the altar. Okay? And then we would take the other goat. Anybody want to guess at what that goat was called?
Scapegoat.
It's called the scapegoat. Scapegoat comes from the goat for Azazel. That's where that term came from. It's not actually a biblical term. It's the term we gave it. Okay? And the reason for that is, let's see, somebody left the cabinet door open in my house. I would go through and think of who most likely would have left the cabinet door open without any proof and just assume that they did it. They would get in trouble. They're the scapegoat. Whether they did or not, they got in trouble for leaving the cabinet doors open. The scapegoat. But here, this goat is also going to represent the guilt of all the people. So the priest would also take a red string or red scarf, strip of material of wool, But this time he wouldn't place it around the goat's neck. He would intertwine it all around the horns. And it was kind of tied to where he couldn't just like fling his head and throw it off. Okay? It's attached. It's attached. Yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. Once again, he would confess the sins of the nation. Remember, the first time it was for the sin offering. It was for the atonement of the sin. This time it's for the guilt. So this is not just to cover the sins, but it's also to relieve the guilt. Do you know how many times people are willing to come to the altar and give up their sins, but they're not as willing to give up the guilt?
Yep.
That's a real thing, because the guilt fills a hole. It's kind of like negative attention's better than no attention. Some people would rather feel guilt than nothing at all. And so they don't trust that God has something so much more powerful and so much more fulfilling than guilt, that they would rather hold on to what they know than to trust Him and give up the guilt.
That's right.
That would preach right there, and it's good. I'm a amen that myself. How about it take? Okay, so he would confess the sins of the nation, and then a succession of people. So it wasn't just one person, but a group of people would take this goat outside of the city. So it would be like this group takes it this far, and then another group would come in and take it a little further, and then another group of people would take it a little bit further, until they had it way outside of the camp. They didn't take it to the edge of the camp where the last person, the little drifter person was, and then it's like, okay, y'all just hang out. This goat can hang out by this, they don't clean out their tent anyway, they'll never notice, a random goat with a red string around its horns hanging out. And they took it way out into the wilderness. So during this time of the tabernacle, they would actually take it way out into the wilderness. In fact, there's one place that talks about a strong man taking it really far out there. That's not how it started, but eventually that's where it got. They wanted to have somebody who wasn't going to die on the way back, like, he could run a few miles or whatever. But originally it was groups of people that would take them out. This picture, remember I talked about types and shadows and a picture of the New Testament. The idea behind this was that sin was being sent far away from the camp, because the camp represented the presence of God. It was there in this community. And so they represented their sin on this goat, and they sent it far away, never to return. Because the concept is, once the sin had been confessed and the atonement had been made, distance needed to be put between the people and the sin. Let me say that again. After the sin had been forgiven and covered, distance needed to be placed between the people and the sin.
Right.
Because if the sin or the goat is put back in the pen just in case it comes in handy later, as plan B in case this whole living for God thing doesn't work out,
Yeah.
it's not truly a repented sin. If there's another option or a plan B is going to come into action.
Yep.
It's kind of like saying, I'm never going to drink again. I'm done with alcohol. But just in case I ever fall into temptation, I'm going to put this alcohol right here in my cabinet. But I'm going to lock the door. I mean, I have the key, but I'm going to lock the door so I don't see it, because I'm done with that.
That's right.
The idea is to put the distance between the sin and the atonement.
Right.
Put it away. All right? So the modern day concept of that is repent.
Yeah.
That means go the opposite direction. You go one way, the goat goes the other. Okay? That's the concept behind that. So the reason that the red wool was wrapped around the horns of the scapegoat. Do you know what's amazing about goats? Let me tell you a story about my dear friend, Sister Dalton. I love her dearly. And I sent her a picture of the wreath I had made for my front door, because we send each other these random posts and memes and stuff all day. It's hilarious. I love her. And I sent her a picture of my fall wreath or my winter wreath or something I had done. And she was like, oh, that's so cool. Well, later she texted me. She said, so you inspired me. And I was going to make a wreath for my front door. And so I opened my front door to look and see how I could do this. And she sent me a picture. And she's got these 2 goats. They've got like their face shoved up against the window. And she's like, nope. My 2 goats know, like, this is their porch. They do whatever they want. They wander, and they come up to the porch. They're like dogs. They're hilarious. She's like, I have goats. No, this is their home. The crazy thing about goats is that sometimes they can be really dumb,
Yep.
but they always find their way home. So if you wander it out into the wilderness, and it just kind of watches you, guess what's going to come trudging back for supper? Hey, you left me. I was just out there in the wilderness. Here I am. Huh, you forgot me. Here I am. Isn't that just like sin?
Yep.
I am done with you, sin. And they turn around and it's like right there. Hey, you missing me?
Yep.
Miss me yet?
That's right.
Let's talk about all those good times we had together. Just like a hateful old goat. Sometimes it's like the screaming goats. It's just like you think everything's good and peaceful, and then out of the blue, ah, there it is, right in your face. That's exactly how sin works. When you think you've gotten rid of it. If an animal tried to come back home, if the scapegoat, okay, the one for Azazel tries to come back home, people would recognize it because of the red cord wrapped around its horns. This is beautiful. It was a community thing. So if anyone saw this goat trying to make its way back into the community, they would throw rocks at it. They'd shoo it away. They'd push it this way, whatever. Anytime it got near, they would rush it off, or they'd lead it back into the wilderness. They would shoo it away. They would do whatever they had to get it away from the people. Rest assured that your weight, your temptation, your sin will try to sneak back into your surroundings, and it will try to blend in with its surroundings. That's one reason why we are to confess our sins. When you put your hand on a sin and you name it, you can no longer justify it. I'm going to say that one again too because it's good. When you name a sin and you confess it, you no longer have the power to justify it. If you have, Lord help me, if you have been deceitful and you have lied through your teeth and you know you have and God has convicted you of that, and you say, Lord, forgive me for lying through my teeth. I have been deceitful and I am wrong. God, forgive me. You can't go back and justify that and say it wasn't a lie because you spoke it. You know. It's in your mind. It is clear. It is a sin. Do you know what else you have for protection? If you go to someone that you trust, someone that's trying to live for God, and you say, I struggle with this. It is in my nature. It's in my family heritage, whatever. We lie. We're good at lying. We can do this good. I mean, we should have been politicians. We're good at lying. But what I'm doing is wrong, and I've asked God to forgive me for it. When that happens, you've just brought in community that when they see that goat sneaking back in your life, they have the ability to shoo it away. They can say, you know what, you told me one time you struggle with this. Let's look at this for a second. Do you see that you might be falling into that trap? That's accountability. God gave you community so people can help you with that.
Yeah.
And when you have a loving church family, that doesn't mean you have holiness police. But if you have someone that you trust, and everyone should have somebody that you trust, you should be able to confess something, name it, and those people can help you, if nothing else, in prayer to help protect you and your mind in those
That's right.
things. When you name it, it's a lot harder for it to sneak back into the goat pen. All right. Eventually, the goat would die. Eventually. It'd be out in the desert. It's wandering around. It's hot. It's hungry. It's thirsty. Eventually, it dies. The red wool. So during this tabernacle period of time, if somebody were out wandering in the wilderness, they're going from one camp to another or whatever, and they would see this goat out in the wilderness where it had died. The thought pattern was that a person who came up on the goat would see the cord wrapped around the horns of the goat, and where the sun had bleached it out and it was white, it would be assigned to them that this was the goat for the guilt. But God has relieved the guilt. He has forgiven the sins and he has relieved the guilt because the red cloth is no longer red. Now it's white.
Right.
Okay? That is the original concept behind this. Now, later on, we don't have this in the Bible. This is from, I don't remember if it's from the Midrash or the Talmud, one or the other. There is a legend. It's rabbinical writings, okay? These are writings and traditions, stories that are told by the rabbis through the years. The story is that the rabbi could put down every year on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, that he would see miraculous things happen every year. And it wasn't just one thing. It was several things. It was a miracle or miraculous things that he would see in the camp. But once he became elderly, he noticed that the miracles were not as frequent. The things that he used to see, he's not seeing so much anymore. He lived during those 400 years of silence between Malachi and Matthew, when the Ark of the Covenant was no longer in the Holy of Holies, and the children of Israel had turned their back on God, and there were just a few select that were living right. There was a whole lot of tradition and no spirit. During this time, he noted that there were some of the miracles that were not happening anymore. According to the rabbinical writings, around AD 60, where they used to be able to physically watch the red cord change from red to white as the goat would go out into the wilderness, it stopped. You know what happened around AD 60? Anybody? Jesus died on the cross. That's what happened. The final atonement happened, and the cord never turned white again after that, according to Jewish tradition. There are Jewish, not philosophers, what are they called? Whatever they are. I'm sorry, I'm brain dead right at the moment. Whatever they are, that will argue that it had nothing to do with Jesus' death on the cross. Well, we're going to look at that in a minute and prove them wrong. The fact is that the sacrificial system was no longer in place because the ultimate sacrifice had been made. It's pretty wild. AD 60 that's a fluid date, just for the record, because I see a lot of people are like, that doesn't make sense. But Jesus he wasn't born on day zero, year zero. So that's, anyway, we'll look at that later too. Actually, I think we already have. But anyway, okay, moving on. This concept, I want you to understand some of the traditions and the rituals, because then when you read stuff like Isaiah, who says, though your sins may be as scarlet, they will be white as snow. He's referencing a scarlet tie around the horns of the sin, the scapegoat, that's going to become white. It's all right. You've got to have faith. See, that scarlet cord doesn't instantly turn white. They had to have faith in God that through his miraculous hand and power that cord was going to turn white. Maybe in the process of time. I don't know. By the time of the second temple, the people still led the goat out of the city, but this is when they have Jerusalem set up as their capital and all this kind of stuff. They would take the goat out of the city and they would back him up to a cliff, and they would antagonize him and tease him until he finally fell off the cliff. And that was a quicker way. They didn't have to worry about him wandering back into the city because he was dead. And so the concept behind that is that Azazel actually means cliffs. That's one of the thoughts. And so they do that translation as it's a goat for the cliffs. Ancient Hebrew doesn't have a clear interpretation in all words, so there's a little bit of disagreement on that. I don't really know. So some people do believe that means rocky, or the rocks and the cliffs. So let's talk about Azazel for a second. Long after Leviticus is written. Now this is gonna touch home. So y'all, if you're asleep, wake up on me. Everybody stretch, yawn, whatever you got to do. The name Azazel became associated with Satan or Hasatan, Satan. That was something that came quite a while later, because the Jewish people didn't have a concept of Satan like we do. It's that's a whole nother study on itself. But later on, it became associated with Satan, or the accuser of our, the accuser or the enemy of our soul. That's kind of what it became associated with. The scapegoat had horns. That's why Satan is presented as having horns during the Middle Ages in artwork. Ever wondered why Satan has a pitchfork and a pointy tail and horns? Anybody ever read a verse about that? No? So I probably just ruined every Precious Moments Bible there is, or Action Bible. But the truth is, he doesn't. Yeah. Anyway, so this is actually a picture of Azazel from 1825. This was an artist in Paris that just, anyway. Anybody notice anything particular about him? I know the picture's not real fabulous, but it's a couple hundred years old. Anybody notice anything with him? That's a goat. That's the scapegoat. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history here, a little bit of correlation. Goats are not evil. Weird? Yes. They're not evil. But there's an association with things. And whenever something is taken from its context and then it's associated with something, it becomes something that can be used as a representation of something evil. Okay? I'm not telling you not to go buy goats. Goats are fine. Goats are innocent. That has nothing to do with it. But it's the presentation or the association with evil that is wrong. Okay? All right. So I want to read something to you here. This was a headline last year, August of 2018 in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is one of very many. There's actually been several instances just like this. But this was a headline. The Satanic Temple temporarily places a bronze statue of a goat-headed winged creature called, you want to say it, Baphomet. Can you say it? Anybody say it? It's, yeah, you'll see it in just a second. I actually even pulled up how to pronounce this, and then I forgot to press play. Huh? Yeah, we'll call him that. Anyway, they set up a creature called him at Arkansas State Capitol during a rally to call for the removal of the Ten Commandments monument already mounted at the Capitol grounds. About 150 Satanists, atheists, and Christians attended the First Amendment rally Thursday. The Satanic Temple says that the Ten Commandments monument violates constitutional freedom of religion rights, and that the installation of their 7.5-foot tall statue showing the 14th century idol seated and accompanied by smiling children would demonstrate religious tolerance. Welcome to the symbol of the Satanic Church. Anybody recognize that? That's the scapegoat. That is the representation of sin and guilt taken on as the symbol for the Church of Satan. Now, obviously, there's no power in that statue. But I would not have that statue in my house. Why? It's associated with evil. The statue itself isn't evil. What it represents is. Let me show you how that works. When you align yourself with something that you know represents evil, you are leaving an open door to let that spirit,
That's right.
that form of demonic whatever, know,
That's right.
hey, there's just a little bit of a crack right there in the door that I can get in.
Mm-hmm.
It happens by desensitizing you. Now, most of you would probably see this and either say that's weird, something doesn't feel right about that, he's got demonic symbols all over him, look at him with his children, their loving gaze up at his little demonic pentagram up there at the top. Something isn't right about this, right? that makes your spirit kind of go, ugh. Yes? Mm-hmm. Let me show you another one. Avon, express yourself. This is an advertisement I saw this week. I didn't have time, but there are clothing lines that have the scapegoat on them along with demonic symbols. The horns are huge right now. There's all kinds of things that are very blatantly attaching themselves to the signs of the demonic.
Yeah.
Let's throw in one more.
Yep.
Everybody recognize her? Let me tell you about this woman. How do you say that?
Oh wait, Maleficent, sorry.
Maleficent. Let me tell you about Maleficent. When my girls were little, I loved Disney cartoons. I still love Disney cartoons, and so I'm very. It hurts me whenever there are some that come in that are just flat out demonic. And I was so excited when we first got Sleeping Beauty because that one came out, and do you know what year it came out, Melissa? It was like 100 years ago. I don't know, not that long, but it seems like it. It was an old movie. And I was so excited because, she's singing, it's beautiful, it's this gorgeous little cartoon, it's precious, it's innocent. And so I turned it on for my girls, and I walked out of the room, and I'm cleaning house or whatever, half paying attention to it, thinking childhood memories, whatever, oh, Disney World, oh, princes and princesses and all that. And then I hear this wonderful statement come out of somebody's mouth that says, I call the powers of hell. And they start summoning up all of these demonic powers and imps and demons to assist them. Yeah. I about came out of my skin trying to get to that DVD player. I was like, what in the world is this? That was her. In this ancient cartoon calling up the forces of hell for her assistance. I did not associate her with the representation of evil. Yes, she's a witch, but, goodness. Witches have been around forever, huh? That changed my world when I started listening. Imagine if my little girls had decided they were going to do role play and one of them was going to be the princess and the other one's going to be casting spells. That door that's open.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what else happens with this. Children become desensitized to the evil because they don't know its origins. They don't know that it's associated. Especially in a world right now, we're in this crazy entertainment deal where people, they praise witches and warlocks as the heroes, the good people. The Bible speaks very clearly of those calling evil good and good evil and being confused on which one's which. Okay, so anyway, Disney's, it's romancing the devil. That's what that is. So remember back to the scapegoat. It represented guilt. If there is one thing that will destroy a relationship, it's guilt.
Yep.
If there is one thing that will destroy your prayer life, it's guilt.
That's right.
Guilt is powerful, and it suppresses itself so you don't see it immediately. You may not even realize that you're feeling guilty. You may think or confuse it with another emotion. But hope restores. Hope is there when guilt moves. Leviticus chapter 15, or verse 15. And bring his blood within the veil. Let's look at that. Then shall he kill the goat of the sin offering. That is for the people. And bring his blood within the veil. And do with his blood as he did with the blood of the bullock, and sprinkle it upon the ark cover and before the ark cover. Go ahead to my next one. Oh, I missed a slide. Isn't it a picture of the ark? Yeah. Okay. So here's the Ark of the Covenant. You have the high priest. He's in before the presence of God, and he's got the blood. The only thing that can atone for the sins of the people. is the blood. And once a year it gets to go beyond the veil. But only once a year. It was like placing forgiveness on layaway. It doesn't really pay it off, but it just holds that account for another year. He would sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat 7 times. Let's fast forward to the New Testament. Over 1,000 years after this ritual has taken place, thousands of times, the goats have died. Thousands of goats have died. A lot of goats have died. But none were capable of taking away the sins forever. Because they were just goats. They didn't have that kind of power. But there is hope. Imagine feeling completely separated from the presence of God. That, I can't even, knowing that there is a veil between you and the presence. Hebrews 6:19 says, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul. Do you have that? We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and steadfast.
Yeah.
It enters the inner sanctuary beyond the curtain, where Jesus, our forerunner, has entered on our behalf.
Yeah.
Because he has become our high priest forever. Jesus only had to go behind that veil one time.
Yep.
One time. Hebrews 9:11 through 12. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but the means of his blood, thus securing eternal redemption.
Yeah.
Do you know what that means? This veil would open, or it would come up, or whatever. It would happen to where the priest could go in once a year. But it was a solid veil, so it's not something that could just kind of like blow open or whatever. It was meant to separate.
Yeah.
Only the high priest could go in. But on that day, when Jesus hung on the cross, and he cried in a loud voice, and he gave up the ghost, he said, "It is finished." It is finished doesn't mean I give up. It is finished means it's completed.
Yeah.
It's done.
Yeah.
I won. When he closed his eyes and gave his spirit up, his spirit didn't linger. It went beyond the veil.
Yeah.
Now imagine, I didn't even think about this until now, so y'all, I'm serious, y'all are hearing the first time, just let me. But I started thinking about that. You've got a priest that goes in and out of this veil, and it stays closed, it stays intact. But when the presence of God, as the high priest, enters through that veil, it rips. It's 7.5 feet tall, it's taller than the average man, and it rips from the top to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to rip material, you don't start down here and rip it up. You rip it. When the presence of God entered into that temple and the veil split, he was the perfect sacrifice. He says he didn't go in with the blood of rams and bulls and all that like the high priest did. His blood gave him access into the Holy of Holies. Isn't that awesome?
Thank you, Jesus.
He entered once and for all into the holy place. Verse 24, for Christ has entered not into the holy place made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly. Every year a goat had to die. But not repeatedly as the high priest enters into the holy place every year with blood that's not his own. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once and for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. For you. For me. Once and for all. Because only his blood was perfect enough to go onto the mercy seat. That's worth thanking him for. Anybody want to worship him with me?
Hallelujah, hallelujah.
God, I love you.
Hallelujah.
Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to go into your presence. God, that you loved us so much that you gave that ultimate sacrifice. God, I love you and I praise you, Jesus. God, I thank you for your presence that's come here where we are. That you love us that much. God, I praise you and I worship you, Jesus. God, I thank you for the ability to go beyond the veil, Jesus. God, I thank you for that hope that comes in your presence, Jesus. God, help us to have a clear understanding of what that is, God. Open our eyes and our hearts and our minds, God. Lord, I love you and I praise you, Jesus, and I thank you, God.
I worship you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus.
I can see I'm very animated in the way I see things. I can see once Jesus allowed his body to die, I can see him in his spirit saying, finally. And as he rips that veil that has separated us and him, he's ripping it. He's saying, no more. Nothing's going to stop. Now I can interact with my people. Now I can feel them. Let me take this a step further. You are surrounded with people, by people, who have no hope. You are surrounded by people who feel like they have no hope. We can sit in here and enjoy the presence of God because we understand that guilt and depression, oppression is not of him. We understand that. We take it for granted. But there are people who feel like every day they are doomed and there's no reason to go on. Did you know that suicide is the #1 killer of teens? My Lord. Those are our babies. Teenagers. In a world where suicide is glorified. We have movies and TV series that talk about how awesome and romantic suicide is. We have friends talking each other into taking their own life because there is no hope and the confusion is there. All they see is darkness.
Yeah.
We have this hope,
Yeah.
but it's not ours to keep.
That's
If we could ever get a burden to share that hope with someone else. I want us to bow our head and we're going to pray together. We're going to ask God to lay hearts on lay names on our heart and help us to see the ones that we need to get hope to. Lord, I love you and I praise you, God. Lord, I thank you for your direction and your guidance. God, I ask that you would touch every heart and every mind here tonight, God. Lord, you know every person that we come in contact with. God, God, I know that you are drawing people, Jesus. I know that your Spirit is drawing. Lord, I ask that you would touch our hearts, God, and our minds, Lord. God, help us, Jesus, to be aware. Open our eyes to those around us, Lord, that need hope. God, give us the wisdom. Lord, you said that if we ask, you would give us the spirit of knowledge and the spirit of wisdom and the spirit of understanding. You said that when we receive the Holy Ghost, we would have power to become witnesses. God, I am claiming that on the authority of your word. Lord, I ask that you would impart power and anointing, Jesus. God, I claim it. Your name. I bind the spirit of intimidation in the name of Jesus. It has no place here. Spirit of fear, you have no place. Upon the authority of the word of Jesus Christ, we will have spiritual authority, and we claim the power to become witnesses. In the name of Jesus. God, I worship you and I praise you, God, and I thank you now for what's going on and what's going to happen. God, I claim every promise. God, I claim what you have for Huntsville and what you have for New Vision. Lord, I love you and I thank you for it. In the name of Jesus. Thank you. Praise you, God. Are you willing to let him do that in you? Because me praying it doesn't make the difference if you're not willing. If I'm not willing. I've probably had 7, 8 people this week tell me they're looking for a home church. That's not a coincidence. God's doing powerful, mighty things. And he's going to use you to do it, if you'll let him. Do we have any thoughts, anything that needs to be added, any questions? All right. And you can be dismissed or you can hang out